The grenadiers crouch in the sweltering darkness, their scarlet coats black with sweat. Before them looms Fort San Lazaro, its stone bastions crowned with Spanish cannon. It is the 20th of April, 1741, and Lieutenant General Thomas Wentworth has ordered the night assault that will decide the fate of Cartagena de Indias, and with it, Britain's ambitions in the Spanish Main. The plan was simple. Under cover of darkness, British infantry would storm the fort's unbreached walls before Spanish gunners could find their range. Speed and surprise would compensate for the absence of artillery support. Admiral Vernon had promised his ships would be in position to support the assault. But dawn is breaking, and the fleet remains anchored beyond the harbor. The advancing soldiers are silhouetted against the rising sun. Spanish muskets erupt from the parapets. Canister shot tears through the ranks. Within minutes, the assault has become a massacre. Men fall by dozens, then by scores. Those who reach the walls find no scaling ladders. They were forgotten in the hasty preparations. Officers shout contradictory orders. The formations dissolve into chaos. By mid-morning, the survivors are streaming back towards their landing point, leaving 600 dead and wounded on the blood-soaked ground. This disaster represents the climax of Britain's most ambitious Caribbean expedition and its most comprehensive failure. More than 180 ships and 30,000 men had sailed against Cartagena 3 months earlier. It was the largest amphibious force Britain would assemble until the 20th century. Yet, by May, the expedition would limp away in disgrace, having lost more men to disease and military incompetence than to enemy action. 9,000 casualties in 10 weeks. Some regiments suffered 90% losses. History remembers Nelson at Trafalgar and Wellington at Waterloo. It has largely forgotten Thomas Wentworth at Cartagena, a forgetting that is itself instructive. For whilst Britain's naval supremacy was built on celebrated victories, it was equally shaped by catastrophic defeats that taught painful lessons about joint operations, tropical warfare, and the limits of military power. The Cartagena expedition of 1741 stands as perhaps the most comprehensive failure in British military history, a cautionary tale of ambition untempered by preparation, coordination, or understanding of the enemy or the environment. This is the story of how 30,000 men could achieve nothing against 3,000 defenders, how the largest fleet in the Royal Navy could be defeated not by Spanish guns but by mosquitoes, how two commanders could despise each other more than they feared the enemy, and how a disaster of such magnitude could be so thoroughly erased from national memory that most Britons today have never heard of it whilst in Colombia. The defense of Cartagena remains a defining moment of national pride. To understand this extraordinary debacle, we must begin not with the battle itself, but with the man who found himself thrust into command of its most critical phase, Lieutenant General Thomas Wentworth, a capable but inexperienced officer who would discover that competence alone cannot overcome circumstance. Thomas Wentworth was born around 1693 into the Yorkshire gentry, third son of Sir Matthew Wentworth, 3rd Baronet of Breton. His was a world of landed estates and military tradition, but as a younger son, he could expect neither title nor inheritance. His future lay in the professions, the church, the law, or the army. He chose the army. In January 1710, aged 16, Wentworth matriculated at University College, Oxford, a typical preparation for a gentleman's career. But his education was brief. By his early 20s, he had secured a commission, beginning the slow climb through the purchase system that governed British military advancement. Birth and connections mattered enormously, but so did money. Each step up the ladder required purchasing one's commission from the previous holder. This system favored the wealthy and well-connected, whilst ensuring that officers had a financial stake in their positions. Wentworth's early career followed the pattern common to officers of his generation. Britain, in the early 18th century, was almost constantly at war. The War of Spanish Succession, the Jacobite rebellions, intermittent conflicts with Spain and France. Yet for many officers, military service consisted of garrison duty, administrative work, and long stretches of peacetime routine. Actual combat experience was surprisingly rare. Wentworth spent decades in service without commanding troops in battle. What he did develop was administrative competence and political connections. In 1732, he became colonel of what would become the 39th Regiment of Foot, holding the position until 1737. Then he transferred to command of the 24th Regiment of Foot, later the South Wales Borderers, which he would lead until 1745. These were positions of prestige and profit. Colonels drew income from their regiments, but they did not necessarily indicate combat prowess. Wentworth's temperament appears to have been cautious, methodical, perhaps excessively concerned with proper procedure. Contemporary accounts suggest a man who valued order and hierarchy, who preferred planning to improvisation, deliberation to decisive action. These qualities served him well in peacetime administration. They would prove less suitable for the chaos of amphibious assault in the tropics. His political career paralleled his military one. In 1743, he was returned as Member of Parliament for Whitchurch, representing the constituency until his death. He married Elizabeth Lord, daughter of a London merchant, in 1720, a match that brought financial security, if not grand connections. The marriage was childless, and little else is recorded of his personal life. Wentworth emerges from historical records as a figure of competent obscurity, a solid officer of the second rank, neither brilliant nor incompetent. This was the man who, in January 1741, found himself thrust into supreme command of Britain's largest expeditionary force. The appointment came not through merit or ambition, but through misfortune. The expedition's original commander, Lieutenant General Lord Cathcart, had died at sea on the 20th of December, 1740, after 13 days of illness. His second in command, General Alexander Spotswood, Governor of Virginia, had died even before Cathcart. Command descended to Wentworth by seniority, a matter of bureaucratic accident. Wentworth cannot have welcomed the appointment. He was 50 years old and had never commanded troops in a major engagement. The expedition he now led was unprecedented in scale and complexity. 29 ships of the line, 22 frigates, 80 troop transports, 50 merchant vessels, 15,000 sailors, and 12,000 soldiers, including 6,000 newly raised Marines and 3,600 colonial troops from America. This armada, spread across months of sailing from Britain and the American colonies, had converged on Jamaica with ambitious plans to capture Spain's principal Caribbean strongholds. The strategic objective was clear. Britain sought to break Spain's monopoly over South American trade and establish bases from which to threaten Spanish treasure fleets. The political pressure was intense. The war, dubbed the War of Jenkins's Ear after a sea captain who claimed Spanish coast guards had severed his ear, had been demanded by merchant interests and popular opinion. Parliament expected victories. The public had been promised Spanish gold and territory, but Wentworth inherited an expedition already compromised by delay and disease. The fleet had been delayed, in Britain by contrary winds and French naval movements, losing 3 months of valuable campaigning time. When the ships finally reached Jamaica in late 1740, tropical diseases began their work. By January 1741, before a shot had been fired, the expedition had suffered. 500 dead from typhus, scurvy, and dysentery, with 1,500 more on the sick lists. Every week of delay in the Caribbean meant more men falling ill. Worse, Wentworth discovered himself yoked to a partner who would prove more adversary than ally, Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, 20 years Wentworth's senior. Vernon was everything the general was not experienced: aggressive, supremely confident, politically connected, and possessed of an ego that filled every room. Vernon had captured Portobello in 1739 with just 6 ships, an achievement that had made him a national hero. Commemorative medals were struck. Places were named in his honor, including Mount Vernon in Virginia, home of Lawrence Washington, who had served under Vernon. The admiral basked in public adulation and believed his judgment infallible. The relationship was poisoned from the start. Vernon, accustomed to independent command, resented sharing authority with a land officer he considered inexperienced. Wentworth, thrust into a position beyond his preparation, clung to formal procedure and military hierarchy. Vernon wanted speed and audacity. Wentworth insisted on deliberation and proper preparation. Vernon believed the Navy could accomplish anything. Wentworth understood that soldiers needed artillery, engineers, and time to conduct sieges properly. Their councils of war became exercises in mutual frustration. Lord Cathcart's death had left the command structure ambiguous. Was this a naval expedition with army support, or vice versa? Who held ultimate authority? The ambiguity would prove fatal. In early March 1741, the fleet finally departed Jamaica for Cartagena de Indias. Wentworth sailed with 12,000 soldiers, 2,000 fewer than had arrived, the rest already dead or too sick to fight. He commanded 2 regular infantry regiments, the 15th and 24th Foot, 6 newly raised Marine regiments, and 4 battalions of American colonial troops. Most had never seen combat. The Marines were so newly recruited that many still lacked basic training. A third of the American colonials had been dispersed to serve aboard ships, replacing dead sailors, leaving Wentworth with fewer than 400 available for land operations. As the vast armada sailed towards Cartagena, Thomas Wentworth must have contemplated his situation with mounting dread. He commanded the largest British military expedition in living memory. He had never led troops in battle. His forces were depleted by disease. His naval counterpart barely concealed his contempt, and they were sailing towards one of the strongest fortifications in the Spanish Empire, defended by a commander whose tactical brilliance would soon become legendary. The stage was set for one of the most comprehensive military disasters in British history, a catastrophe not of a single battle, but of accumulated failures of command, coordination, and comprehension. The next 2 months would demonstrate that overwhelming force, unopposed by weather and supplied by the world's finest navy. We could still accomplish nothing if those wielding it could not work together or understand the nature of warfare in the tropics. The British fleet appeared off Cartagena de Indias on the 13th of March, 1741. Even cynical Spanish observers must have felt their hearts sink at the sight. 186 ships stretched across the horizon, the largest concentration of naval power the Caribbean had ever witnessed. Their canvas covered the sea like a moving city. 29 ships of the line mounted over 2,000 cannon amongst them. It appeared an irresistible force. Defending Cartagena was Admiral Blas de Lezo, a man whose physical condition matched the apparent hopelessness of his situation. He had lost his left leg at the siege of Toulon, his left eye at the Battle of Malaga, and the use of his right arm at Barcelona, all before his 20th birthday. Now 52, this half-man, as he called himself with grim humor, commanded just 6 ships of the line and approximately 3,000 men, 2,700 regulars from the Aragon, España, and Toledo regiments, 600 sailors, 300 militia, and 600 indigenous archers. Against 30,000 British attackers, Lezo's situation appeared hopeless, but Cartagena was no ordinary target. The city had been captured by Sir Francis Drake in 1586 and sacked by French privateers in 1697. Each time, Spain had strengthened its defenses. By 1741, Cartagena boasted some of the most sophisticated fortifications in the Americas. The city itself was protected by massive walls mounting 160 cannon, whilst outlying forts commanded the approaches. Most critically, the harbor had only one deep-water entrance, the narrow channel of Boca Chica, where ships could pass only in single file under the guns of Fort San Luis. Vernon and Wentworth faced an immediate decision: where to attack. Vernon advocated for an assault on Boca Chica, arguing that once the outer harbor was secured, Cartagena must surrender or face bombardment from the sea. Wentworth, more cautious, worried about landing troops under fire and conducting siege operations in the tropical heat. But Vernon's confidence carried the counsels of war. The attack would focus on Boca Chica. On the 22nd of March, British forces landed on the Tierra Bamba Peninsula near Fort San Luis. The Spanish defenders of two small outlying forts, San Iago and San Philip, were driven off by naval bombardment. 300 grenadiers went ashore first, followed by the bulk of Wentworth's army. The landing was unopposed. Lezo had decided not to defend the beaches, but rather to concentrate his forces in the forts. What followed was a dinner, textbook siege operation that showcased both British capabilities and the seeds of later disaster. Wentworth's soldiers, including 300 American colonials and 300 enslaved laborers brought from Jamaica, constructed artillery batteries. The work was backbreaking in the tropical heat, but within 2 weeks, 20 24-pound guns were emplaced and ready to bombard Fort San Luis. On the 5th of April, the combined assault began. British artillery pounded the fort, whilst a squadron of 5 ships, the Boyne, Prince Frederick, Hampton Court, Tilbury, and Suffolk, moved inshore under Commodore Richard Lestock to add their broadsides. It was a disaster. Spanish gunners, firing from prepared positions, savaged the British ships. The Shrewsbury alone suffered 100 casualties. The naval attack was called off after achieving nothing except demonstrating that Spanish fortifications could withstand naval bombardment. But the land batteries proved effective. After 3 days of sustained fire, the British guns had breached Fort San Luis's walls. On the 9th of April, facing imminent assault, the Spanish garrison evacuated during the night. They had lost 30 killed. The British had suffered 120 killed and wounded, with another 250 dead from yellow fever and malaria. 600 more lay sick in hospital ships. Vernon was jubilant. In his mind, the campaign was effectively won. He sent premature dispatches to London announcing victory, boasting that he had opened the gateway to Cartagena. British newspapers would print these reports, and medals would be struck, commemorating the conquest of Cartagena, even as the expedition was collapsing into catastrophe. Wentworth was more circumspect. The capture of Boca Chica had cost 2 weeks and revealed disturbing realities. Disease was killing more men than Spanish guns. The heat was debilitating. Soldiers working in the sun suffered heat stroke by dozens. The naval-army cooperation that had worked at Boca Chica existed only because Vernon had been willing to commit his ships. What would happen when he was not? The answer came as the expedition prepared to attack Cartagena itself. The outer harbor now secured. British forces needed to enter the inner harbor and land near the city. But between them lay Fort San Felipe de Barajas, a powerful fortress on a hill controlling the landward approach to Cartagena. Fort San Lazaro, a smaller work, covered San Felipe's approaches. The relationship between Vernon and Wentworth, strained from the beginning, now collapsed entirely. Vernon insisted that Wentworth's soldiers should storm the forts immediately, arguing that delay would allow disease to consume the army. Wentworth demanded proper siege operations, trenches, batteries, methodical bombardment. He needed engineers, artillery, and time. Most critically, he needed the fleet to land reinforcements and supplies at specific points. Vernon refused. He would not risk his ships in the confined waters of the inner harbor, where Spanish fire ships might destroy them. He would not detach sailors to assist with landing operations. He complained that Wentworth was timid, that he lacked offensive spirit, that he was letting victory slip away through excessive caution. Wentworth, for his part, was discovering the reality of tropical campaigning. Every day, 50 to 100 men fell ill with yellow fever, malaria, or dysentery. Hospital ships were overwhelmed. Bodies awaited burial on the beaches, where the tropical heat accelerated their decomposition. The stench was overwhelming. Flies swarmed in clouds. The only British engineer had been killed at Fort San Luis, leaving no one with expertise in siege operations. Under relentless pressure from Vernon, Wentworth agreed to assault Fort San Lazaro without proper siege preparations. The attack was scheduled for the night of the 19th of April, a night assault that would prevent Spanish gunners from finding their targets. Wentworth, who had never commanded troops in combat before Cartagena, now prepared to lead a night assault against a fortified position. The plan's desperation reflected the expedition's deteriorating situation. The attack was bungled from the start. Scaling ladders were forgotten or lost in the darkness. Units became separated. The assault was supposed to begin in darkness, but delays pushed it to Cruve 4, dawn, exactly when Spanish defenders could see the advancing British formations. Wentworth later claimed he had protested the plan but been overruled by Vernon. Vernon claimed Wentworth had bungled the execution through incompetence. Spanish defenders opened fire as British grenadiers advanced across open ground. Canister shot cut through the ranks. Men fell in heaps. Those who reached the walls found no way up them. Officers shouted for the scaling ladders, but none came. For 3 hours, British soldiers huddled under the walls, whilst Spanish musketry and artillery tore through them. By mid-morning, Wentworth ordered the retreat. The losses were catastrophic. 600 men killed or wounded out of the 1,500 who had made the assault. Some companies lost 80% of their strength. The American colonial troops, who had fought with particular courage, were decimated. The Spanish suffered fewer than 100 casualties. Worse than the battlefield losses was the psychological impact. British soldiers had attacked a fortress whose walls they could not scale. Under fire, they could not answer. In an assault they knew was futile from the beginning. The survivors streaming back to the landing beaches were no longer an army, but a collection of frightened, exhausted, diseased men who had lost faith in their commanders. Vernon and Wentworth's relationship degenerated into open hostility. Each blamed the other for the disaster. Vernon accused Wentworth of cowardice and incompetence, of failing to support the assault adequately, of not inspiring his troops. Wentworth accused Vernon of refusing naval support, of goading him into a premature attack, of sacrificing soldiers to his own impatience. The councils of war became exercises in mutual recrimination. Officers took sides. The expedition's unity dissolved. Meanwhile, disease continued its inexorable work. By late April, Wentworth had fewer than 6,600 effective soldiers from the 12,000 who had landed. Some regiments had lost 90% of their own strength to disease. The hospitals were charnel houses. Surgeons, themselves falling ill, could do nothing except watch men die of fevers they did not understand. On the 24th of April, another council of war considered the expedition's options. Vernon wanted to continue the attack. Wentworth argued that the army no longer had sufficient strength to conduct offensive operations. The debate became heated. According to witnesses, Vernon accused Wentworth of abandoning victory through cowardice. Wentworth replied that Vernon's refusal to provide naval support had doomed the outer assault. The two men were barely on speaking terms. On the 28th of April, a Biscayan sailor escaped from British captivity brought news to the Spanish defenders that Wentworth's troops were re-embarking. The expedition was over. By the first week of May, British forces had evacuated their positions. Blas de Lezo's 3,000 defenders had repulsed 30,000 attackers through a combination of skillful defense, effective fortifications, and the relentless ally of tropical disease. The fleet limped away from Cartagena, leaving behind graves marking the disaster. Of the 12,000 soldiers who had landed in March, fewer than 3,000 were fit for duty. 9,000 were dead, dying, or invalided. The naval losses were equally severe. 15,000 sailors had been reduced to fewer than 8,000 effective. 6 ships had been lost. 17 ships of the line were so damaged they required complete refits. The expedition that was to have conquered Spanish America had been utterly destroyed. The voyage back to Jamaica completed the catastrophe. Packed into unsanitary transports, weakened by months of campaigning and poor diet, the survivors fell victim to epidemic disease. Yellow fever swept through ship after ship. Men who had survived battle died miserably in the stifling holds. By the time the fleet reached Jamaica in late May, more than 2,000 additional men had perished. In all, the expedition had lost between 18,000 and 20,000 men, making it one of the deadliest military disasters in British history. Some American colonial companies returned with fewer than 20 survivors from 150 men who had sailed. The 24th Regiment of Foot, Wentworth's own command, had been reduced to a fraction of its strength. The defeat was so comprehensive, the losses so staggering, that the British government would suppress details for years. Yet in London, those premature victory dispatches had already been published. Medals had been struck, showing Vernon receiving Cartagena's surrender from its kneeling governor, an event that had never occurred. The British public, told of glorious victory, would not learn the truth for months. And when they did, the magnitude of the disaster ensured it would be quietly forgotten, erased from popular history by embarrassment and the desire to move on. Admiral Vernon and General Wentworth returned to England in September 1742, not in triumph but in mutual recrimination. Their bitter dispute had already consumed the expedition's final months in the Caribbean. After Cartagena, they had attempted operations against Cuba and Panama, achieving nothing except further casualties to disease. By mid-1742, even Vernon acknowledged the West Indies expedition had failed utterly. The Admiralty and War Office faced an impossible situation. The Cartagena expedition represented the largest military failure in living memory. Yet Vernon was a national hero whose political connections reached the highest levels of government. Wentworth, whilst less celebrated, was a member of Parliament and had powerful defenders. Neither man could be openly punished without provoking political crisis. The official response was an inquiry that satisfied no one. Both commanders were recalled and their joint command dissolved, but neither faced court-martial. The blame was diffused across multiple causes: inadequate intelligence about Cartagena's defenses, the virulence of tropical disease, the difficulty of coordinating naval and army operations, the death of Lord Cathcart. Vernon was quietly sidelined. His career effectively ended despite his earlier triumphs. Wentworth retained his regiment and political position, but never held field command again. In 1743, Wentworth was elected member of Parliament for Whitchurch, a position he held until his death. He served briefly in Flanders and participated in operations during the Jacobite Rising of 1745 under Field Marshal George Wade, but always in subordinate roles. The Cartagena disaster had permanently marked him. He was promoted to lieutenant general in 1745 and given command of the 5th Dragoon Guards, but these were honors reflecting his political position rather than military distinction. Thomas Wentworth died in November 1747, aged 54, without issue. His death merited only brief mentions in contemporary records. The Dictionary of National Biography notes him primarily for his command at Cartagena, describing him as an officer of more than average ability who found himself in an impossible situation. It is a generous assessment. Wentworth was competent but uninspired, methodical but indecisive, careful but uninspiring. He was a garrison commander thrust into leading the largest amphibious operation Britain had attempted, partnered with a naval officer who despised him, against a fortress he lacked the engineers and artillery to reduce properly. History has been only slightly more charitable than his contemporaries. Military historians examining Cartagena invariably focus on Vernon's hubris and the catastrophic losses to disease. Wentworth appears as a secondary figure, blamed by Vernon but defended by modern scholars who note his impossible position. The few historians who examine his role carefully conclude that whilst he made tactical errors, particularly in the assault on Fort San Lazaro, the expedition's failure owed far more to factors beyond any commander's control. So why did history forget this disaster? The answer lies partly in the comprehensiveness of the failure and partly in deliberate suppression. The British government had little interest in publicizing the loss of 20,000 men in a futile expedition. Vernon's premature victory dispatches had created a narrative that proved impossible to fully retract. Newspapers had celebrated Cartagena's fall. Quietly correcting the record months later generated little attention. The medals struck, commemorating victory, became historical curiosities, their inscriptions mocking the reality. More profoundly, Cartagena occurred at a moment when Britain's attention shifted rapidly to larger conflicts. By 1742, the War of Austrian Succession had begun, drawing British forces into European campaigns. The Caribbean theater became a sideshow. Vernon's earlier capture of Portobello provided a narrative of success that British historians preferred to emphasize. Cartagena could be quietly forgotten and largely was. In Spain and particularly in Colombia, the defense of Cartagena became foundational to national identity. Blas de Lezo, the one-eyed, one-legged, one-armed admiral who had defeated Britain's largest fleet, became a national hero. Statues were erected. Streets were named in his honor. The battle entered Colombian historical consciousness as a defining moment, proof that determination and skillful defense could overcome overwhelming force. Ironically, Lezo himself died in September 1741, likely from plague contracted from the piles of unburied corpses outside Cartagena's walls. His death came just weeks after his greatest triumph, and he died in disgrace with Spanish authorities who blamed him for friction with the viceroy. Only later generations fully recognized his achievement. The lessons of Cartagena were genuine and important, though Britain learned them slowly. The expedition demonstrated beyond question that tropical disease represented a greater threat than enemy action in Caribbean campaigns. Yellow fever and malaria would kill tens of thousands of British soldiers throughout the 18th century. Not until the 20th century would medicine understand these diseases' mosquito vectors and develop effective countermeasures. The disaster also highlighted the absolute necessity of unified command in joint operations. The Vernon-Wentworth dispute was not merely a clash of personalities but a structural failure. 18th century Britain had no established doctrine for joint naval army operations, no clear chain of command. no procedures for resolving disputes between services. Every decision required consensus in councils of war, a system that magnified personal animosities and prevented decisive action. Later, British expeditions would develop clearer command structures, though the problem of joint operations bedeviled British forces well into the 19th century. The campaign's tactical lessons were less clearly learned. The night assault on Fort San Lazaro demonstrated the extreme difficulty of such operations without extensive preparation. Yet British forces would repeat similar errors in subsequent campaigns. The failure to conduct proper siege operations, to emplace adequate artillery, to allow engineers to do their work, all these mistakes would recur. The assumption that naval superiority alone could compel the surrender of fortified positions proved tragically wrong at Cartagena, but would be repeated elsewhere. Perhaps most significantly, Cartagena demonstrated the limits of expeditionary warfare conducted at vast distances from home bases. The 3 months lost to delays before the expedition even reached the Caribbean proved fatal. Every week in the tropics cost hundreds of men to disease. Modern military theorists studying amphibious operations point to Cartagena as illustrating the tyranny of distance, the reality that even overwhelming force decays rapidly when operating far from supply bases in hostile climates. For modern military professionals, Cartagena offers enduring lessons. The United States Marine Corps Staff College studies the campaign as an example of joint operations failure. British staff colleges examine it as a case study in command dysfunction. Military historians note how closely it parallels later disasters like Gallipoli, ambitious amphibious assaults, undermined by inadequate planning, divided command, and insufficient appreciation of the defensive, advantages enjoyed by prepared defenders in strong positions. The campaign also offers sobering insights into the limits of technological superiority. Britain's fleet represented the cutting edge of 18th century military technology. Its ships were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than their Spanish opponents. British soldiers carried superior muskets and were better trained than Spanish colonial troops. British artillery was more advanced. None of it mattered. Spanish defenders in prepared positions, supported by strong fortifications and aided by disease, achieved a defensive victory that modern military theorists still study. One might ask, what if Cartagena had succeeded? The strategic implications would have been profound. A British base at Cartagena would have threatened Spanish communications throughout the Caribbean and given Britain a permanent foothold on the South American continent. Spanish colonial trade would have been severely disrupted. The flow of silver from Peru to Spain might have been interdicted. Yet, this counterfactual highlights precisely why Cartagena mattered so much and why its failure represented such a comprehensive defeat. Britain had committed its largest expeditionary force to achieving strategic objectives that failure made impossible. In the broader sweep of British military history, Cartagena represents a forgotten turning point. It demonstrated that naval supremacy alone could not deliver colonial conquest. It showed that British forces lacked the medical knowledge, logistical systems, and command structures necessary for sustained operations in tropical environments. These lessons, learned at terrible cost, would eventually shape British imperial strategy in the Caribbean and beyond. The irony is that Britain's failure at Cartagena arguably strengthened Spanish America more than a British victory would have damaged it. The successful defense demonstrated that Spanish colonial possessions could resist even the largest British expeditions. This may have delayed British colonial expansion in the remote Caribbean and South America, allowing Spanish power to persist for another 80 years until the independence movements of the early 19th century. For Thomas Wentworth personally, Cartagena represents a cruel historical judgment. He was neither brilliant nor incompetent, neither cowardly nor heroic. He was an average officer thrust into extraordinary circumstances, yoked to a difficult partner, given impossible tasks, and blamed for failures beyond his control. History has remembered him, when it remembers him at all, primarily as Vernon's antagonist, a supporting player in someone else's drama. Yet there is something instructive in Wentworth's obscurity. Military history celebrates great commanders and memorable victories. It studies spectacular disasters like Gallipoli or the charge of the Light Brigade. But most military failure is less dramatic, the product not of momentary folly, but of accumulated incompetence, poor planning, divided command, and simple bad luck. Wentworth's career exemplifies this mundane reality. He made mistakes, but no more than most officers would have in his position. His greatest error was accepting a command beyond his experience. History has judged him harshly for this. Yet who among us can say we would have refused? Today, few traces of the 1741 campaign remain visible. Cartagena's colonial fortifications still stand, meticulously preserved as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Fort San Felipe de Barajas dominates the hilltop, where British forces spent themselves in futile assault. The walls where Spanish defenders repulsed the night attack on Fort San Lazaro still bear witness to the battle. Colombian tourists visit these sites to learn of their nation's greatest military victory. In Britain, there are no monuments to Cartagena. Thomas Wentworth's grave is unmarked and forgotten. Admiral. Vernon is remembered primarily for inventing grog, the rum and water mixture he ordered served to sailors to reduce drunkenness. The medals struck to commemorate Cartagena's conquest have become collector's items, valued precisely for their ironic celebration of a victory that never occurred. The expedition itself appears in few history books and is unknown to most Britons. This forgetting itself constitutes a kind of historical failure. Remembering victory is easy and celebratory. Remembering defeat requires confronting uncomfortable truths about miscalculation, incompetence, and the limitations of military power. Britain's historical memory has preferred to dwell on Trafalgar and Waterloo, on victories that confirmed national greatness. Cartagena, like many defeats, has been quietly erased. Yet, modern military professionals would do well to remember Cartagena precisely, because it was a failure. Its lessons remain relevant to any military considering expeditionary operations. The necessity of unified command, the importance of understanding the operating environment, the requirement for proper logistical preparation, the reality that overwhelming force can be negated by disease, terrain, and skillful defense. These lessons, purchased with 20,000 British lives, deserve remembrance. Recent historical scholarship has begun to redress this imbalance. Military historians examining 18th century amphibious warfare now give Cartagena extended treatment. Studies of joint operations invariably cite the Vernon-Wentworth dispute as a cautionary example. Medical historians studying tropical disease note how profoundly it shaped British imperial expansion. Colombian historians have worked to internationalize awareness of Blas de Lezo's achievement. Thomas Wentworth deserves a better epitaph than history has given him. He was not a great commander, but great commanders are rare. He was a competent officer who served his country for nearly half a century, who found himself in an impossible situation and did his best. That, his best proved inadequate, reflects more on the circumstances than the man. He died unmourned and has been largely forgotten, yet his story contains more lessons than many more celebrated careers. The Siege of Cartagena stands as a reminder that military history is written primarily by victors, but it is also written by survivors. The British soldiers and sailors who returned from Cartagena, those few who returned, carried with them memories of a disaster that official histories preferred to obscure. Their stories, preserved in letters, journals, and regimental histories, offer a counter-narrative to the triumphalist accounts that dominated public discourse. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson of Cartagena is one of humility. Military power, however overwhelming, cannot guarantee success. Planning, coordination, understanding of local conditions, respect for disease and climate, unity of command, all these matter as much as the numbers of ships and men. Britain learned these lessons at Cartagena, though slowly and incompletely. The 20,000 men who died there purchased knowledge that would shape British imperial strategy for the remainder of the British 18th century. They deserve to be remembered not as failures but as sacrifices to lessons that needed learning. Thomas Wentworth, their reluctant commander, deserves recognition not as a great general, but as a capable officer overwhelmed by circumstances. The expedition's collapse was not the failure of individuals but of systems, command structures, medical knowledge, strategic planning that proved inadequate to the demands of tropical amphibious warfare. History has judged Cartagena and found it wanting of remembrance. Perhaps it is time for a reassessment. Not all lessons come from victories. Not all heroes emerge from triumphs. Sometimes, understanding failure teaches more than celebrating success. The siege of Cartagena, forgotten by most, deserves its place in British military history, not despite its failure, but because of it. A cautionary tale of ambition untempered by preparation, of confidence unwarranted by understanding, of courage unrewarded by success. Thomas Wentworth commanded 30,000 men and achieved nothing. That fact alone makes his story worth remembering. Based on my comprehensive research, I now have sufficient information to write a complete documentary script about Thomas Wentworth and the Siege of Cartagena, 1741. This is indeed a remarkable story of British military failure, ICO, one of the worst disasters in the Royal Navy's history, overshadowed by more celebrated defeats. The expedition featured the largest British amphibious force assembled in the 18th century, yet ended in catastrophic failure due to disease, poor joint command, and tactical mistakes.